Alvin Cary York was not born to be a soldier, at least not in the traditional sense. He came into the world on December 13, 1887, in a small, rugged valley of Pall Mall, Tennessee, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. His family was extremely poor. Alvin was the third of 11 children, and the York household survived mainly through farming, hunting, and odd jobs. From an early age, Alvin was thrust into the responsibilities of survival, chopping wood, planting crops, and most importantly, hunting game in the dense forests of Tennessee. His marksmanship became legendary in his community, not because of formal training, but because hitting a squirrel in the head with a single rifle shot was the difference between food on the table and an empty stomach. Despite his natural skill with weapons, Alvin York was not an aggressive man by temperament. He grew up with little formal education, his schooling ended after the 3rd grade, and much of his worldview was shaped by the rough, rural lifestyle of his family and by the strong influence of local churches. York was known as a man caught between two identities. In his youth, he often drank heavily, gambled, and got into fights, gaining a reputation as a troublemaker. However, after the death of a close friend in a drunken brawl, he underwent a profound spiritual transformation. York embraced the teachings of his church, becoming a devout Christian and strict pacifist. He believed deeply in the commandment "Thou shalt not kill," and by the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, Alvin York was convinced that his duty was to stay out of violence entirely. This created a dramatic conflict when he was drafted into the U.S. Army. York initially filed as a conscientious objector, claiming that his faith prohibited him from taking human life. His application was denied, as his denomination was not recognized as pacifist by the government. Reluctantly, he reported for service, torn between loyalty to his faith and his obligation to his country. His officers, recognizing his sincerity, encouraged him to take time and reflect. Through long conversations with his commanding officer and extensive reading of the Bible, York struggled to reconcile his beliefs. Eventually, he came to a personal conclusion: defending the innocent and stopping evil was not the same as murder. Though the decision weighed heavily on him, York accepted his role as a soldier, carrying with him the conviction that he would fight not for glory, but for a higher sense of justice. By the time he reached the battlefields of France in 1918, Alvin York was already a man of contrasts, a farmer with the accuracy of a sharpshooter, a pacifist turned reluctant warrior, and a poor rural son who was about to step into the pages of history. When the United States declared war on Germany in 1917, Alvin York's life changed forever. At nearly 30 years old, he was drafted into the army, something he deeply resisted because of his faith. York had filed as a conscientious objector, believing that killing was against God's will, but his application was rejected since his church was not officially recognized as pacifist by the U.S. government. Forced to report for duty, York entered training with heavy doubts, unsure if he could ever take a human life. His commanders quickly noticed his sincerity and did not treat him as a coward. Instead, they encouraged him to reflect, even giving him leave to return home and think about his decision. During this period of prayer, Bible reading, and conversations with his officers, York came to believe that protecting the innocent and stopping evil could also be seen as part of God's plan. With this new conviction, he returned to his unit ready to serve. York was assigned to the 328th Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Division, and trained as a rifleman. Though still troubled inside, he resolved that if he had to fight, he would do so with skill, courage, and a clear conscience. By the autumn of 1918, the First World War was entering its final but bloodiest phase. The German army, though weakened and exhausted, still held a powerful line of defenses stretching through the Argonne Forest and along the Meuse River in northeastern France. To break this, the Allies launched what became known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, beginning on September 26, 1918. It was the largest operation ever conducted by the American Expeditionary Forces and one of the most brutal battles of the entire war. The terrain was unforgiving: dense forests, steep ridges, deep ravines, and well-fortified German positions hidden behind layers of barbed wire and concrete machine gun nests. Soldiers advancing through the thick woods often could not even see their enemy until bullets ripped through the trees. Rain and mud turned the ground into a nightmare, slowing movement and clogging supply lines. Communication broke down, artillery support was unreliable, and confusion reigned on both sides. For the Americans, many of whom were fresh troops with little battlefield experience, this offensive was a baptism of fire. The goal was clear: push the Germans back and sever their vital supply routes, but achieving it came at a terrible cost. casualties mounted by the tens of thousands. Units became isolated, cut off in the chaotic terrain. It was in this grinding, desperate struggle that Alvin York and his comrades found themselves in early October 1918. The operation would test every soldier's courage, endurance, and will to survive, setting the stage for York's extraordinary act of bravery. In the early morning of October 8, 1918, the forest near the village of Tel Chhry was shrouded in fog and tension. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was raging at full intensity, and York's unit, the 328th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 82nd Division, had been ordered to advance against a heavily fortified German position. The enemy machine guns, hidden on a ridge overlooking a valley, had already inflicted terrible casualties on American troops trying to move forward. The attack had stalled, and every moment lost meant more lives cut down in the muddy, blood-soaked ground. York's company received a dangerous mission. They were to slip behind the German lines and silence the machine gun nests that dominated the area. It was a small detachment, just 17 men under the command of Sergeant Bernard Early. Moving cautiously through the dense forest, they followed a ravine and managed to get behind the German positions. At first, the plan seemed to work. They surprised a group of German soldiers, capturing them without a shot fired. But the situation turned deadly almost immediately. Unbeknownst to them, German reinforcements were positioned nearby, and soon machine guns opened up from the ridge, pinning the Americans down. The deadly chatter of the Maxim guns echoed through the forest, cutting through branches, leaves, and men alike. Within seconds, several of York's comrades were killed, and others wounded. The mission was on the brink of collapse. It was at this moment that Alvin York stepped forward. Until then, he had been a reluctant soldier, quiet, obedient, yet still wrestling with the morality of killing. But now, as he saw his friends falling around him, something within him shifted. He understood that if no one acted, they would all die, and the entire advance might fail. The responsibility weighed heavily, but his years of hunting in the Tennessee woods had prepared him for exactly such a moment. York pressed himself into the cover of the forest floor, calmly taking aim with his rifle. His experience as a marksman showed instantly. He picked off German gunners with deadly accuracy, one by one. Every shot was deliberate, every pull of the trigger measured. He was not firing wildly in panic, but methodically, like hunting turkeys back home. When one target fell, he immediately shifted to the next. The Germans, stunned by the sudden precision fire, tried to overwhelm him with a bayonet charge. A group of them rushed downhill, hoping to finish him quickly. York later recalled that it reminded him of hunting a flock of wild turkeys. When they come at you in a line, you must shoot the one in the back first, so the others don't see the fall and scatter. Applying that same logic, he started from the rear and worked forward, dropping each man in turn before they could reach him. Meanwhile, his surviving comrades struggled to hold the captured prisoners, but York kept the enemy's attention on himself. His pistol came into play as Germans closed the distance, and with a Colt M1911 he dispatched several attackers at near point-blank range. The chaos of the moment was overwhelming, bullets snapping through the air, shouting in German and English, the screams of the wounded, but York moved with almost unnatural calm, driven by a mixture of instinct, faith, and necessity. What made the scene even more extraordinary was the sheer imbalance, one man, almost alone, against dozens of entrenched enemies. The German positions were not just a single nest but a network of guns and troops spread across the hillside. Yet York's relentless fire began to break their will. German soldiers, unable to understand how so few Americans could inflict such damage, started hesitating, ducking behind cover instead of manning their weapons. The turning point came when a German officer, recognizing York's dominance, tried to rally his men for another charge. York, however, shot him before he could complete the order. Without leadership, the resistance faltered further. Slowly, incredibly, York gained control of the situation. What had begun as a desperate ambush threatening to annihilate his squad was transforming into an opportunity. By the time the gunfire subsided, most of the immediate threat had been neutralized by York's actions. His small group, though battered and reduced, was now in a position not only to survive but to press forward. York had set the stage for what would soon become one of the most remarkable captures in military history. But in that moment, surrounded by fallen comrades and stunned prisoners, the weight of what he had done had not yet fully settled on him. To York, it was not about heroism or glory, it was simply survival, duty, and the protection of his brothers in arms. This was the true beginning of the feat that would make Alvin York a legend, the moment he transformed from a reluctant soldier of conscience into the decisive force that turned the tide of battle in a forgotten corner of the Argonne Forest. As Alvin York and his small detachment pressed deeper into the Argonne Forest, the situation quickly turned from precarious to desperate. The firefight that had erupted after their initial ambush had already cost them dearly. Out of the original 17 men, many were either killed or gravely wounded. Only a handful remained capable of fighting, and they were outnumbered by a well-entrenched German force. What was supposed to be a quick strike against a few machine gun nests had become a life-or-death struggle. The Germans, recovering from the shock of York's precise rifle fire, regrouped. Dozens of enemy soldiers manned Maxim machine guns on a ridge overlooking the valley, while others began maneuvering to encircle the Americans. The crack of rifles and the rattling of automatic fire echoed through the trees, branches splintering overhead as bullets tore through the forest. York and his comrades were pinned down in the open, the ground around them turning into a killing field. It was in this moment of near-certain defeat that York's inner transformation became complete. He realized that hesitation meant death, not just for himself, but for the wounded men and the captives they had already taken. York later described how he prayed silently even as bullets whistled past him. He asked God for guidance, and in that instant, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. He no longer thought of himself as a man breaking the commandment "Thou shalt not kill." Instead, he believed he was chosen for this task, that his skill with a rifle was meant to serve a greater purpose, to save lives by ending the slaughter. Driven by this conviction, York rose into action with uncanny calm. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot deliberate and fatal. He moved with the precision of a hunter, switching targets before the enemy could react. The Germans attempted to rush him in groups, believing sheer numbers would overwhelm one man. But York recalled his hunting strategies back in Tennessee. Just as he had with turkeys or deer, he started from the back of the line and worked forward, ensuring that the front attackers didn't realize their comrades behind them had already fallen. The charge dissolved in chaos. German soldiers dropped one by one, and those who survived scrambled for cover, shocked by the impossibility of the situation. How could one American, nearly alone, cut through their ranks so efficiently? York's skill and composure began to break not just their bodies, but their will. Still, the fight was far from over. At least 6 active machine guns remained, spitting streams of fire across the battlefield. The air was alive with death, and York knew he had to silence them before they could regroup. Crawling and darting from cover to cover, he advanced alone while his surviving comrades held back with the prisoners. York closed the distance, picking off gunners with his rifle, then switching to his Colt pistol when enemies charged too close. His ability to remain calm under relentless pressure was almost supernatural. Witnesses later said it seemed as though bullets simply could not touch him. At one point, a group of German soldiers attempted to flank York from the side. He turned on them, firing until his pistol clicked empty, then calmly reloaded and continued the fight. Another time, a German officer, realizing York was the key to their destruction, drew his pistol and charged. York dropped him with a single shot, the officer collapsing before he could rally his men. Each of these small moments built upon one another, turning what should have been York's annihilation into a steady tide of victory. The true critical moment came when York found himself face to face with overwhelming numbers. Surrounded by dead and wounded, with only a handful of Americans still standing, he faced nearly 100 German soldiers still in fighting condition. Yet instead of faltering, York pushed forward with relentless determination. His actions were no longer just about survival, they were about domination of the battlefield. By sheer force of will, he forced the enemy into a psychological collapse. York's steady rifle fire silenced one machine gun after another, and soon entire crews abandoned their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. German officers, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, began calling out for their men to cease fire. The tide had turned. Where moments earlier the Americans had been on the brink of destruction, now the Germans were the ones trapped and demoralized. For York, this was the critical turning point, not only of the mission, but of his life. In that chaotic forest, he had proven that his reluctant decision to fight was not in vain. He had overcome fear, doubt, and overwhelming odds. He had turned what looked like certain defeat into an impossible victory. By the time the gunfire died down, Alvin York had almost single-handedly forced an entire German stronghold to its knees. Over 130 German soldiers would soon be marched back as prisoners, and York's name would be etched into history. But at this moment, kneeling among the wounded, surrounded by surrendered enemies, the full weight of his actions had not yet settled. For him, it was not heroism, nor glory. It was necessity. It was faith. It was survival. When Alvin York returned home from Europe in 1919, the world was eager to celebrate him as a legend. Parades were organized, newspapers hailed him as the greatest American hero of the First World War, and countless admirers wanted to meet the quiet men from Tennessee who had single-handedly changed the course of a battle. Yet for York himself, the transition back to civilian life was not simple. He was, at his core, still the same humble farmer from Pall Mall, deeply religious, modest, and reluctant to embrace fame. York's legacy began not with the medals pinned to his chest, but with the choices he made after the war. Many expected him to cash in on his heroism. Companies offered him lucrative deals to appear in advertisements, politicians tried to pull him into public office, and promoters suggested he write books or sell his story. York refused. He believed it was wrong to profit from the killing he had done, even if it had saved lives. He turned down offers worth fortunes, insisting that his faith and conscience would not allow him to turn war into a business. This decision, though it kept him poor for much of his life, only added to the respect people had for him. Instead, York chose a different path: service to his community. He focused on improving education in the mountains of Tennessee, where he himself had grown up without proper schooling. He founded the York Agricultural Institute, a school built to provide opportunities for children who otherwise would have lived in poverty and ignorance. To York, this was a greater victory than any battlefield conquest, arming future generations not with rifles, but with knowledge. As years passed, York's story continued to grow. In the 1920s and 1930s, America still remembered the Great War, and his name was synonymous with courage. Yet York himself lived quietly, farming, raising a family, and speaking occasionally at public events. During the Second World War, his legend was revived as inspiration for a new generation of soldiers. The U.S. Army used his example to remind recruits that even an ordinary man, driven by conviction, could accomplish extraordinary deeds. The pinnacle of his cultural legacy came in 1941, when Hollywood released the film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper. The movie, which dramatized York's life and his famous battle in the Argonne, became a massive success. It won 2 Academy Awards and turned York into a household name once again. What made the film particularly special was York's involvement. Though initially reluctant, he agreed to let Hollywood tell his story on the condition that the profits support his educational foundation. This decision further cemented his reputation as a man who cared more for others than for personal wealth. York's later years were marked by health struggles. He suffered a stroke in the 1950s and lived much of his final decade bedridden. Still, he remained a symbol of humility and faith, visited by admirers, politicians, and even presidents who sought to honor him. When he died in 1964, the nation mourned the passing of not just a soldier, but a man who had become larger than life without ever seeking to be. He was buried with full military honors in Tennessee, close to the hills where he had once hunted as a boy. Today, York's legacy endures in multiple ways. His name graces schools, highways, and monuments. The York Agricultural Institute still stands as a testament to his commitment to education. The film about his life continues to be shown in classrooms, reminding new generations of his journey from reluctant pacifist to reluctant hero. His story is taught not only as a tale of battlefield courage, but also as a lesson in humility, faith, and the idea that greatness often comes from the most unlikely places. What makes York's legacy so powerful is the balance of contrasts. He was a man who hated war but became its most celebrated soldier. He was uneducated but dedicated his life to building schools. He was offered fame and wealth but chose poverty and service. His battlefield actions showed what one man could do under unimaginable pressure. His post-war life showed what one man could do to heal and uplift his community. For historians, York's actions remain a benchmark of individual heroism in modern warfare. For ordinary people, his life is proof that even the most humble background does not prevent someone from changing the world. For soldiers, his name is a reminder that courage is not about aggression, but about doing what must be done when all hope seems lost. Alvin C. York's legacy is not just the story of a farmer who captured 132 Germans. It is the story of a man who proved that faith, humility, and conviction can create a hero greater than medals, greater than fame, and greater than war itself. When the firefight reached its breaking point, Alvin York stood at the center of chaos, carrying the fate of his small unit on his shoulders. With most of his comrades dead or wounded, and German fire still pouring from the ridge, it seemed impossible for any man to hold his ground. But York did not act like an ordinary soldier that day. He moved with a calm precision that belonged more to a hunter in the Tennessee woods than to a man trapped in the largest battle of World War I. York's training was not from the army, it was from years of survival in the mountains. As a boy, he had fed his family by hunting wild game, and every shot had mattered. Wasting a bullet meant going hungry. Now, in the Argonne, that same discipline ruled his every move. With his Springfield rifle in hand, York lay low, waiting for the bursts of German fire to pause, then quickly rising to fire a single, deadly accurate shot before ducking back down. Each time he rose, another machine gunner fell. The Germans were stunned. They were not facing a reckless attacker charging blindly. They were facing someone who seemed to know exactly when and where to strike. A Maxim crew of 6 men fell one after another, York calmly working down the line. Then he shifted his aim to another nest, dropping their gunners before they even realized they had become his next targets. The battlefield turned into something surreal, one-man dismantling positions meant to hold back hundreds. When the Germans realized that their machine guns were being silenced one by one, they decided on a desperate move, a bayonet charge. A group of soldiers leapt from cover and ran straight toward York, their shouts echoing through the forest. Most men in his place would have panicked. York did not. He later explained it in simple words, "I just naturally turned and shot them like I would a flock of turkeys." He began with the soldier furthest back, working forward, so that each man in line kept charging, unaware that the men behind him had already fallen. By the time they reached York, none were left standing. As the fight closed in, York drew his Colt M1911 pistol. With steady hands, he fired at German soldiers who had come too close for his rifle. At one point, 6 men rushed him at once, thinking they could overwhelm him. He dropped them all in quick succession, never losing control of his breathing or aim. The forest floor was littered with fallen attackers, while York himself remained untouched, almost as if protected by some invisible force. Through it all, York was not acting out of rage or bloodlust. His mind was calm, focused, almost detached. He later said that he felt God was guiding his hands, that every bullet found its mark because it was meant to. He did not think of the men as enemies to hate, but as obstacles to remove in order to save lives, his own, his comrades, and perhaps even those of the Germans who would surrender rather than die. Bit by bit, the tide shifted. Machine guns that had raked the battlefield went silent. German soldiers began hesitating, ducking rather than firing. York advanced steadily, keeping his rifle ready, his eyes sharp. He ordered surrender whenever possible, but when challenged, he did not hesitate to shoot. The German prisoners already captured by his unit watched in stunned disbelief as this quiet, humble American farmer broke the backbone of a fortified enemy line almost single-handedly. One of the most striking moments came when a German officer, realizing the futility of the fight, raised his hands and called out to his men to stop shooting. York, still in position, covered him with his rifle, ready to fire if it was a trick. But the order spread, and more soldiers began lowering their weapons. By the end of the engagement, York had killed at least 20-25 enemy soldiers and silenced multiple machine gun nests. More importantly, his relentless assault and calm authority convinced over 100 German troops to surrender. He gathered them together, standing among them not as a brutal conqueror, but as a steady, commanding presence. With his small band of surviving comrades, he prepared to march them back to the American lines, a column of prisoners so large that officers at first refused to believe it had been captured by so few men. York's actions that day were not just about marksmanship or bravery. They were about control under impossible circumstances. He turned hunting instincts into battlefield strategy, faith into courage, and desperation into victory. His actions were so extraordinary that they seemed unreal, almost mythical. Yet they were witnessed, confirmed, and recorded, one man against overwhelming odds, changing the course of a battle with his calm hands, his rifle, and his unshakable resolve. This was not the story of a soldier seeking glory. It was the story of a man who never wanted to fight at all, but when forced, fought with such skill and conviction that he reshaped history. When the echo of gunfire faded through the Argonne forest, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. Alvin York, the quiet farmer from Tennessee, now stood among the wreckage of a German stronghold. Around him lay silenced machine guns, abandoned rifles, and the bodies of soldiers who had resisted. More shocking than the destruction, however, was the sight that followed: streams of German soldiers, hands raised in surrender, walking toward the very men who had just decimated their defenses. At first, it seemed unreal even to York himself. He had entered the mission with 17 men, only a fraction of them were still alive or uninjured. Yet here, in the thick woods, were more than 100 German troops laying down their arms. Officers among them barked orders for their men to obey, acknowledging that continuing to fight would only mean needless slaughter. The authority and calm fire of York had broken not just their lines, but their spirit. Step by step, the surrender grew. What had begun with a small group of captured Germans snowballed as York advanced, demanding compliance with the same quiet determination that had guided his shooting. Soldiers, many exhausted, hungry, and terrified after weeks of brutal fighting, chose life over death. They placed their trust in the strange figure who commanded them with a mixture of rifle and restraint. In total, York and the remnants of his squad marched 132 German soldiers out of the forest as prisoners. Among them were officers, hardened machine gun crews, and infantrymen who had once held a dominant tactical advantage. Now they shuffled in line, guarded by only a handful of Americans. It was such an extraordinary sight that when York brought the prisoners back to the American lines, his own officers struggled to believe what they were seeing. One colonel reportedly snapped, "I suppose you captured the whole German army?" To which York, in his plain mountain accent, replied simply, "No sir, just 132 of them." The response was as understated as the man himself, but behind those words was an achievement so extraordinary that it would echo through military history. For the Allies, the result was more than symbolic. By eliminating multiple machine gun nests and capturing so many men, York had directly saved the lives of countless American soldiers who would otherwise have been cut down in the advance. The gap created in the German defenses allowed his regiment to push forward, contributing to the overall momentum of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. In a campaign where progress was measured in blood-soaked meters, York's actions had opened a path for hundreds to move forward with reduced losses. The psychological impact was just as powerful. Stories of York's feat spread rapidly among the American ranks, lifting morale at a time when exhaustion and despair were common. Here was proof that courage, skill, and determination could triumph even against impossible odds. Soldiers whispered his name, passing along the tale of how one man, backed only by faith and instinct, had broken the backbone of an entire German position. For the Germans who surrendered, there was humiliation, but also a strange sense of relief. Many of them, young and worn down by years of war, were grateful simply to survive. In surrendering to York, they escaped the brutal slaughter that might have awaited them had the fighting continued. Later testimonies from some of those captured confirmed their disbelief. They had been held at gunpoint by what seemed like an unstoppable force, and once the first machine gun crews fell, they knew resistance was futile. Back at headquarters, the result of York's actions forced higher-ranking officers to take notice. Reports were filed, initial skepticism turned into astonishment, and word of the feat quickly reached the top levels of command. In the cold, bureaucratic language of war, numbers spoke volumes. One corporal, with minimal support, had killed at least 20-25 enemy soldiers, destroyed several machine gun nests, and captured 132 prisoners. It was not just a victory, it was an anomaly, a feat that defied the expectations of trench warfare, where advances usually required massive artillery barrages and thousands of casualties. What made the result even more incredible was York's own attitude. He did not boast, did not exaggerate, and did not present himself as a hero. To him, he had simply done what was necessary to save his comrades and fulfill his duty. His words after the battle reflected his simplicity: "A higher power than man guided and watched over me, and told me what to do." This humility only amplified the impact of the story. York was not a professional soldier or a man seeking glory. He was a farmer, a pacifist at heart, who had reluctantly taken up arms. And yet, through a combination of faith, skill, and sheer determination, he had achieved one of the most astonishing results of the entire war. By the time the day ended, Alvin York's name was already becoming a legend. His feat was reported in dispatches, studied by officers, and soon to be celebrated across nations. But for York himself, the incredible result was not about fame or recognition. It was about survival, duty, and the lives that had been spared, both American and German, because he had stood his ground when it mattered most. If Alvin York had returned from the Argonne Forest alone, claiming that he had silenced multiple machine gun nests and captured 132 German soldiers, no one would have believed him. The feat was so unlikely, so far beyond the expected limits of human endurance, that it bordered on the impossible. But York did not stand alone in history. There were witnesses, both American and German, who confirmed what had happened that October day in 1918. Their testimonies transformed what might have been dismissed as a legend into one of the most documented and respected acts of individual bravery in World War I. The first witnesses were York's surviving comrades from the detachment. Out of the 17 men who had gone with Sergeant Early into the German rear, only a few came out unscathed. They had seen their squad cut down by machine gun fire, and they had watched in disbelief as York, seemingly untouched, rose again and again to return precise, deadly fire. They saw him take command of the situation when their leaders were wounded or killed. They saw him crawl forward through mud and underbrush, rifle in hand, while German bullets churned the earth around him. One soldier later recalled that it was as if York was in his natural environment, not a battlefield but the woods of Tennessee. His calmness under pressure stood out to everyone present. While others ducked and prayed to survive the storm of fire, York moved deliberately, as though each action was planned. Another comrade said, he was just as cool as if he were out hunting back home, only instead of turkeys, he was shooting Germans. When York finally forced the surrender of so many prisoners, those same men had to march the captives back through the forest with him. Their disbelief only grew as the line of Germans swelled, dozens upon dozens of enemy soldiers, guarded by what was essentially a single corporal and a few battered Americans. The surviving witnesses never forgot the surreal image of one man bringing in more prisoners than their entire company could have taken in a week of fighting. But the Americans were not the only ones who testified. Among the German prisoners themselves, the impression was just as profound. Several of the captured officers later confirmed that their men had been demoralized by York's accurate fire and by his refusal to be silenced despite overwhelming odds. One officer admitted that his troops could have continued the fight and perhaps killed York, but the psychological effect of seeing comrades fall one after another under precise, unstoppable rifle shots was too great. To them, it felt as though they were facing not just a man but a force of nature. Some Germans described the situation with a mix of respect and humiliation. They had been trained, fortified, and supported by some of the most powerful defensive positions in the forest, yet they surrendered to a man they later learned was a simple American farmer. The contrast between York's background and his performance on the battlefield only deepened their astonishment. Back in the American lines, when York marched in with his column of prisoners, hundreds of soldiers saw the results firsthand. Officers and enlisted men alike gawked as the long line of Germans, many still carrying the expressions of shock and disbelief, shuffled into captivity. To the onlookers, it seemed like a miracle. They whispered among themselves, questioning how a corporal and a handful of men could have brought in so many prisoners alive. York's own commanders were skeptical at first. Colonel Buxton, the commander of York's regiment, initially thought the report was exaggerated. But when multiple men corroborated the story, and when the captured Germans themselves confirmed the details, the reality became undeniable. Buxton, deeply moved, personally recommended York for the Medal of Honor, convinced that such courage and effectiveness deserved the highest recognition. The witnesses also included journalists and war correspondents who picked up the story soon after the event. Once word spread through official reports, it became a sensation. Yet the accounts all shared a common theme: the heroism was real, but York himself remained modest. He did not embellish, he did not boast, and he often downplayed his role. He gave credit to God, to fate, and to the men who had fought beside him. The combined testimonies, comrades, prisoners, officers, and reporters, created a narrative that could not be ignored. Unlike many wartime legends that were inflated by propaganda, York's feat was verified from every angle. The Germans admitted their defeat, the Americans testified to his calm and deadly efficiency, and the commanders confirmed the numbers. What made these witness accounts so powerful was the consistency of the details. Everyone agreed on York's composure, his precision, and the sheer improbability of what he had achieved. The surviving Americans swore that they had never seen anything like it. The Germans admitted they had lost not because of poor training or cowardice, but because they had been outmatched by one man's determination and skill. These voices ensured that York's story did not vanish into doubt or myth. They preserved the memory of that day in October when a humble farmer stood in the heart of the Argonne, and by sheer willpower and accuracy, turned the tide of battle. The incredible feat of October 8, 1918, could not remain hidden for long. When Alvin York and his small band of survivors marched back with 132 German prisoners, the story spread like wildfire through the ranks. At first, some officers suspected exaggeration. How could a corporal and a handful of men capture so many well-armed enemies? But when reports came in from multiple witnesses, both American and German, the reality became undeniable. Alvin C. York had performed one of the most extraordinary individual actions of the entire war. His immediate commanders wasted no time in ensuring that his bravery was recognized. Colonel Buxton of the 328th Infantry Regiment personally interviewed York and his surviving comrades, cross-checking every detail. Once convinced, Buxton recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The recommendation quickly gained traction, passing through the chain of command and receiving approval at the highest levels. In April 1919, York traveled to Washington, D.C., where he stood before General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, and the Secretary of War. There, in a solemn ceremony, he received the Medal of Honor, the award reserved only for acts of the greatest gallantry. The citation described how York, with his rifle and pistol, killed 20 enemy soldiers, silenced 35 machine guns, and forced the surrender of 132 prisoners, an achievement unmatched in the annals of American military history. But recognition did not stop with his own country. The French, who had seen their homeland ravaged by years of war, were particularly moved by York's actions. They awarded him the Croix de Guerre with Palm, one of their highest honors for valor. The Italians, too, bestowed upon him the Croce di Guerra al Merito, acknowledging his courage and the impact of his actions on the larger Allied cause. York, once a simple farmer from Tennessee, now held decorations from 3 nations, symbols of a world's gratitude. What made these awards even more remarkable was York's attitude toward them. While others might have basked in the fame, York remained humble, often uncomfortable with the attention. He told reporters that he had not sought glory, and that his actions were guided by faith rather than ambition. "A higher power than man guided and watched over me and told me what to do," he explained. To York, the medals were not personal triumphs but reminders of a terrible day when lives had been lost and saved. The American public, however, saw him differently. York was hailed as the greatest American hero of the First World War. Newspapers across the country published his story, and he was invited to parades, ceremonies, and banquets. Politicians courted him, and his name became a symbol of courage and patriotism. He even received offers to endorse products and appear in advertisements, but York refused to exploit his fame for money. His sense of honor and humility never wavered. By the time he returned home to Tennessee, York was no longer just Alvin from Pall Mall, he was Sergeant York, Medal of Honor recipient, hero of the Argonne, a man whose story inspired an entire generation. His medals and awards, though glittering symbols of recognition, were only part of the legacy. The true honor, as York saw it, lay in the lives that had been spared because he had stood his ground when fate demanded it. When Alvin York returned home from Europe in 1919, the world was eager to celebrate him as a legend. Parades were organized, newspapers hailed him as the greatest American hero of the First World War, and countless admirers wanted to meet the quiet man from Tennessee who had single-handedly changed the course of a battle. Yet for York himself, the transition back to civilian life was not simple. He was, at his core, still the same humble farmer from Pall Mall, deeply religious, modest, and reluctant to embrace fame. York's legacy began not with the medals pinned to his chest, but with the choices he made after the war. Many expected him to cash in on his heroism. Companies offered him lucrative deals to appear in advertisements, politicians tried to pull him into public office, and promoters suggested he write books or sell his story. York refused. He believed it was wrong to profit from the killing he had done, even if it had saved lives. He turned down offers worth fortunes, insisting that his faith and conscience would not allow him to turn war into a business. This decision, though it kept him poor for much of his life, only added to the respect people had for him. Instead, York chose a different path, service to his community. He focused on improving education in the mountains of Tennessee, where he himself had grown up without proper schooling. He founded the York Agricultural Institute, a school built to provide opportunities for children who otherwise would have lived in poverty and ignorance. To York, This was a greater victory than any battlefield conquest, arming future generations not with rifles, but with knowledge. As years passed, York's story continued to grow. In the 1920s and 1930s, America still remembered the Great War, and his name was synonymous with courage. Yet York himself lived quietly, farming, raising a family, and speaking occasionally at public events. During the Second World War, his legend was revived as inspiration for a new generation of soldiers. The U.S. Army used his example to remind recruits that even an ordinary man, driven by conviction, could accomplish extraordinary deeds. The pinnacle of his cultural legacy came in 1941, when Hollywood released the film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper. The movie, which dramatized York's life and his famous battle in the Argonne, became a massive success. It won 2 Academy Awards and turned York into a household name once again. What made the film particularly special was York's involvement. Though initially reluctant, he agreed to let Hollywood tell his story on the condition that the profits support his educational foundation. This decision further cemented his reputation as a man who cared more for others than for personal wealth. York's later years were marked by health struggles. He suffered a stroke in the 1950s and lived much of his final decade bedridden. Still, he remained a symbol of humility and faith, visited by admirers, politicians, and even presidents who sought to honor him. When he died in 1964, the nation mourned the passing of not just a soldier, but a man who had become larger than life without ever seeking to be. He was buried with full military honors in Tennessee, close to the hills where he had once hunted as a boy. Today, York's legacy endures in multiple ways. His name graces schools, highways, and monuments. The York Agricultural Institute still stands as a testament to his commitment to education. The film about his life continues to be shown in classrooms, reminding new generations of his journey from reluctant pacifist to reluctant hero. His story is taught not only as a tale of battlefield courage, but also as a lesson in humility, faith, and the idea that greatness often comes from the most unlikely places. What makes York's legacy so powerful is the balance of contrasts. He was a man who hated war but became its most celebrated soldier. He was uneducated but dedicated his life to building schools. He was offered fame and wealth but chose poverty and service. His battlefield actions showed what one man could do under unimaginable pressure. His post-war life showed what one man could do to heal and uplift his community. For historians, York's actions remain a benchmark of individual heroism in modern warfare. For ordinary people, his life is proof that even the most humble background does not prevent someone from changing the world. For soldiers, his name is a reminder that courage is not about aggression, but about doing what must be done when all hope seems lost. Alvin C. York's legacy is not just the story of a farmer who captured 132 Germans. It is the story of a man who proved that faith, humility, and conviction can create a hero greater than medals, greater than fame, and greater than war itself.